this installment of Why You Should Listen To, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite artists, one of my favorite musicians, Nick Drake. Nick Drake, he plays kind of folk. They call it folk rock, but I feel it's folk music. He made records in the 60s and 70s in England. He had a very short life. He died at the age of 26, and he only put out 3 records. But those 3 records have had an enormous influence on music. He went relatively unrecognized during his lifetime, but since then he's become very well renowned for the music that he made. First, I want to talk about why you should listen to Nick Drake. And mostly it's because his music's just really interesting. There's a lot going on, and I'll break down some of the different things that are going on that just make it really interesting and give you a lot to dig through as a listener and as a musician, give you lots of ideas for things to include in your own music. And so one of my favorite things about Nick Drake is he has these motifs in his music that you can listen for. I'm sure there's a whole list of them out there somewhere, but I wrote down a few that I've recognized in his records. So first of all, there's really no love songs. There's not much romantic music from Nick Drake. Nobody knows of any girlfriends that he ever had. He may have never been romantically involved with anyone. Some of his songs have been kind of construed as love songs, but they could also have these other meanings. So it doesn't really seem like he's written many love songs, so he writes about other stuff. So some of the motifs that I find in his music, he's going to talk. He references back to 2 tracks on his first record and his later records. So Five Leaves Left came out in 1969. The 2 tracks that he references back to a lot in later records is Time Has Told Me and Day Is Done. So you're going to hear these references, a lot of references to time in general, and a lot of them end up tying into that track, tying into Time Has Told Me. He talks a lot about the seasons. He's from a fairly rural area in England, so that's probably why. But he's also inspired by a lot of old English authors. He studied literature in university. He did drop out, but he was an avid reader of old English authors. And also from that inspiration, he says a lot with a little. Some of his tracks are very lyrically sparse, but they still say a lot. But yeah, so there's a lot of seasons and nature's references, especially the moon and the sun, the sea, the sky. You hear about that a lot in his albums. There's a character that makes a lot of appearances in his records. Jane or Hazy Jane, or I think in Five Leaves Left, he also calls her Mary Jane. Some people have construed this to be a woman, and for these songs to be written about women. But it's more likely he was a copious marijuana user. It's more likely a reference to weed. But it keeps popping back up, and so you kind of get a picture of the inside of what's going on with Nick Drake. He talks a lot about the ground and those below, and rising from the ground, and it's. At first, when I was first listening to his records, I kind of thought he was being like obnoxious, like, oh, I'm better than all these people that are down under the ground. But what I realized is I've come to realize that it's his way of expressing how differently he feels than the people around him and how little he connects with the people around him. He was well known for being very isolated, particularly towards the later part of his life. He was almost entirely isolated, except for to buy drugs. So he talks a lot about those below, and everyone's going to draw their own interpretations of it. I don't think it comes from a perspective of like, I'm better than you. I think it's more of like, I'm very different than you. But listen to his records and see if you agree. You might disagree with me on that point. That's at first, when I first heard, I was like, oh, he's kind of being like elitist there. And I've come to kind of change my mind on that over time. And yeah, he talks a lot about isolation in his songs. You'll hear a lot of references to isolation in his music as well. His music created moods. There's some musicians who are really great storytellers. Like I think of like Bruce Springsteen. He tells a really good story. Some of these lyricists are John Prine. Some of these lyricists tell really great stories. Others kind of set moods. Steely Dan's a good example of this. Where they set moods and they describe moods more than they tell a story. Nick Drake's definitely like that. He definitely is out there to kind of set a somber, somewhat haunting mood, particularly as you get further into his into his later albums, and especially Pink Moon, his last album. Very somber, very haunting, and the lyrics are kind of there to match up with that. Nick Drake suffered from depression throughout his life, so he suffered from isolation, social isolation. He never got on well with his peers, and he eventually passed away from suicide as well. So, from likely suicide, there's some debate. He had a drug overdose, and there's some debate over whether it was intentional or not. But that isolation, that depression, the psychological problems, you can hear evidence of that throughout the music. So another thing to listen to that's I can almost immediately tell when a Nick Drake record is on. He has a very unique guitar style. It's very distinct, and it definitely stood out to me right away when I was listening to his records. He finger picks for the most part. It's a finger picking style, but he finger picks differently than I've heard before. It's much more like rhythmic, and he kind of does like he'll use his thumb and his pointer finger on the bass string to get this like dubba dum bum bubba dum bum kind of thing going on with the bass, and then countering that with the other fingers on the treble strings. So that's very unique, is the rhythms, but also the harmonies within his guitar playing. What he would do is he would alter chords in ways that chords weren't normally altered, kind of turn them into clusters, which creates more dissonance, which allows you to build tension and resolve. He would use unique tunings on his guitar that allowed him to create these chord clusters of dissonance, and they make his music way more moody, more interesting. It kind of gives you more layers to dig through in those guitar parts. Kind of tying into that, he didn't perform well or often. He had a couple performances earlier on in his music career, and they were failures. He was not a good performer. His big problem was, because of those unusual tunings, he would have to tune in between songs, and he wouldn't talk with the audience. He wasn't socially able to interact with the audience, and he would just stand there silently tuning his guitar and not really saying anything. He wasn't an energetic performer. And performance is definitely an art, and you have to practice it. And perhaps there's some people that really aren't capable of it. Particularly somebody who has the psychological issues that he faced. And this is in a time where you had Jimi Hendrix, you had Janis Joplin, you had David Bowie, Elton John. You had these showmen that would go out and put on these great big shows, and they'd be energetic and connecting with the crowds. And Nick Drake couldn't do that. That's part of the reason that he really wasn't well known during his lifetime, is that he couldn't go out and perform. He couldn't go out and go on a tour or anything like that. And it got to the point where after he had those bad experiences, he was just unwilling to even try and perform at that point, understandably. If he'd been embarrassed a couple times doing it, he didn't see any way he was going to get any better at it. He passed away, and not many people paid much attention to him. He started to get some recognition into the 70s and 80s, but then Volkswagen featured one of his songs on an advertisement, and he really took off since then. And now posthumously, a lot of people recognize his contributions to music. Yeah, so the next section is how to get into listening to him. Luckily, it's really easy. He only has 3 albums. He has 5 Leaves Left, Brighter Later, and Pink Moon. All 3 are available on Spotify. There's some recordings that were taken after Pink Moon and before he died that I think are on a compilation album there as well that you can find. But those are his 3 albums. You can literally listen to his entire catalog in just under 2 hours. So I would say, how to get into Nick Drake. I would go out and just listen to his whole catalog. It doesn't take that long. Personally, my favorite record now is Pink Moon. Pink Moon is his most sparse one. It's really just him and guitar, except for Pink Moon. There's a little bit of piano, but it's very simple, very broken down, very somber. Gives you a lot to dig through, and it's really simple in its presentation. I love it. If you're just looking for kind of like a quintessential Nick Drake song to get you started, I would say Things Behind the Sun on Pink Moon. I'm biased, it's my personal favorite Nick Drake track, but I'd also say it really exemplifies kind of his style. And yeah, it'll give you a good idea if you like his other stuff. But I would definitely give all three records a try because all three have very different sounds to them, and they have different motifs throughout. And like each time you listen to them, you'll start finding new things in them. That's something I like is that they provide for endless entertainment in that way. Since that section is so short, I wanted to talk about some of the music that he's inspired, and some other music that's similar to him. So he had contemporaries, guys that came up in similar music scenes, played similar music at the same time. Donovan, Van Morrison, anything from Island Records. That's the record label he was signed to in England at the time. So Fairport Convention would be a good example of that. Some other guys that play guitar in a similar style and make similar folk music would be like Bert Janisch, John Renbourn. So those could be some that you look at if you like the sound and style of Nick Drake. He's also inspired a ton of music. Most notably, I'd say, is The Cure. So the band The Cure, they actually get their name from a Nick Drake track. I think it's from Five Leaves Left. It's stuff from that first record. I think the line is from Time Has Told Me, and he talks about troubled cure for a troubled mind, and that's where the band The Cure got their name from. So obviously a lot of their music is inspired by Nick Drake's aesthetic. Same with REM, they drew a lot of inspiration from Nick Drake. Beck, Kate Bush, and this one, those are all fairly well known. This gentleman, I don't think he's too well known. His name's Jose Gonzalez. He's an Argentinian Swede, and he puts out very simple guitar and singer records, but they're Nick Drake inspired, and they have this Latin inspiration to them as well. So they're very interesting. I'm going to talk a little more about him later because I don't think he's very well known, and he makes really cool music. So he'd be a cool one to check out. So yeah, I hope you go out and listen to Nick Drake. He's really cool, somewhat underappreciated. Definitely a musician's musician. I would say, as a musician, I think it'd be really hard for a musician to listen to his music and not be inspired by him in some way. It's just so different. It's so intricate in the mood that it sets. It's really crazy that he was able to do what he did. So that's Nick Drake. I hope you go listen to him.